So, the first theme, the series, the Master and Margarita. I'll start with the main thing. What do you think? What problem was Mikhail Afanasyevich Bulgakov solving in this novel, which he wrote? Well, for 20 years he only wrote, and the preparation for it was significantly longer. Our opinion is this. In the novel, Bulgakov wanted to show. This was the first, and in fact it was a feat. He wanted to show that what the Western biblical Christian civilization is based on is factually, if not a forgery, then a very big lie. To put it more simply, then there was no crucifixion. And those who will read our analytical note of January, The Master and Margarita, novel by M. Bulgakov, film adaptation by V. Bortko, they will see that we continue and develop this theme. That is, there was no sacrifice of God. Well, at least because today it is already clear to many that God does not need sacrifices, moreover, human bloody ones. This was necessary for the hierarchy that tried to use the teachings of Christ to their advantage. Of course, we understand, and I think that Bulgakov was also aware, that by doing so, he was going up against not Stalin, and not against that regime that during the time of his creativity had been established in Russia. He was up against a very ancient, deeply conspiratorial power. This is not even the power of the Sanhedrin, although the Sanhedrin is depicted there. The fact is that Bulgakov was born and raised in a theological family. Many of you know that his father was a doctor of theology at the Kiev Theological Academy. And if we look at everything from such positions, from the position of one generation, then the history of Russia cannot be understood. But if from the position of 40 generations, then a lot becomes clear. That is, at least from the standpoint of 1,000 years. Then, from a religious standpoint, it appears in such a way that for 1,000 years, Russian society, the Russian people, overcame idealistic atheism. But at the unconscious levels of the psyche. And Mikhail Afanasyevich already lived in a period when materialistic atheism dominated and was overcome in its own way. Also, at the unconscious levels of the psyche. Such terms as idealistic atheism, materialistic atheism, I assure you, did not exist in the time of Bulgakov. And to describe what he saw, what he envisioned, presented colossal difficulty. Well, as for the fact that there was no execution, the Quran had been saying this, at least by that time, already for 1,300 years. But Bulgakov, besides the fact that he is, of course, the greatest writer, although there are a lot of critics in relation to him, he had 3 wives, dabbled in narcotics, he was also a great psychologist who continued the traditions of Russian writers. This is only in Russia, not to impose the truth on the reader, because he understood that only that truth that was obtained independently, only that truth stands firm. And I hope that many of you have read our book, the Master and Margarita, a hymn to demonism, or the Gospel of Selfless Faith, and read the novel itself. So I'm teaching first-year students, and I ask, who has read the novel The Master and Margarita? Everyone has read it. That is, someone who understood, or out of non-understanding, made it possible, factually, to make the fifth gospel in Russia better than the canonical ones. There are 4 canonical gospels: the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Luke. And Bulgakov wrote the 5th gospel. Why is it better? Because he presented this gospel in an artistic form. And I remember November 1966 very well. Then I was a young senior lieutenant in the Navy. I had just transferred from the active fleet to military science. And my senior friend brings the Moscow magazine, issue 11. I remember the impression the first part of this novel made on me, and how difficult it was then to get the second part. I wanted to bring to show, it is entangled and worn to holes. From 1967 to 1987, another 20 years, the novel was not published. When I bound them together, and I had to wander around all fleets, from Kaliningrad to Kamchatka, and from Murmansk to Sevastopol, I always took these 2 parts of the novel with me on business trips. And I kept records, of course, either on a submarine during tests, or among officers, or a test group, and these are my fellow scientists. I always try to talk about the problems that are touched upon in the novel. And I saw that despite the fact that our society, and we were all party members, we were all communists, that is, in essence, materialistic atheists. Nevertheless, the discussion was always very lively. And I raised the question then. Look, Bulgakov recorded the main theme of the novel in the epilogue. What a vulgar execution, says Pontius Pilate. And in fact, if translated into modern language, then how the great teaching is vulgarized. And second, so tell me, was there an execution? He asks Yeshua. Well, of course, there was not. You imagined it. And now imagine Bulgakov, who wants to convey the truth without imposing it on the reader. I found myself precisely among such readers. On the one hand, a conclusion was made, and on the other hand, there is a chapter in the first part, Execution, where the execution is described in detail, down to the smallest detail. And Bulgakov also knew that there is also the Quran, Surah 4, Ayat 157. And they did not kill him, but they dreamed it. But ordinary consciousness is arranged like this. This, the Quran, is a revelation, and there is no choice. In essence, there is no choice. Either to believe or not to believe, that's all. The paths are very narrow. In the Bible, in the Gospels, there was an execution. In the Quran, there was no execution. Two revelations, but no choice. If you want, believe it. If you don't want, don't. And how to make sure that the reader, I'm talking about the continuation of the Russian tradition in relation to truth, does not have the feeling that something is being imposed on him. You know that Russian writers have no positive heroes. Why? What? Pechorin is a positive hero? Evgeny Onegin, positive hero? Is Bazarov a positive hero? No. These are central characters, with a large share of negativity, or, as we say now, demonism. And every Russian writer, talented writer, creates such conditions that all roads are good. But there is one that leads you to an abyss. You don't need to go there. And builds a story on this, builds a plot. Bulgakov did the same. But he got up over all the writers, because many wonder, who is the central character of Bulgakov's novel Master and Margarita? Some say that this is the master, some say, well, it's directly written, it's a novel about Pontius Pilate. Some say that this is a novel about Margarita, some say that this is society, but somewhere they say that Stalin was hidden in Pontius Pilate. The central character of this novel is, in essence, Bulgakov himself. But he leads the reader to the need to think independently. And so I began to think too. Because, in essence, in history, in historical chronicles, there was no evidence of the execution. There was something in Josephus Flavius, there is some mention, something in Tacitus, but this is always a retelling of someone else. But there is no direct evidence. They say that there was only one witness. This is Matthew Levi, and everyone has to believe his testimony. So, Bulgakov takes this disciple and shows him in all his glory. If you carefully read the chapter Execution, you will see that Matthew Levi could not have seen the execution. Remember that before all this happened, he fell ill. Something like a fever started in him. But this is not enough. Bulgakov very subtly shows several times that Matthew Levi is a liar. Look, Pontius Pilate asks Levi, "Why did you steal a knife from the shop?" And he replies, "To cut the ropes." But in fact he stole the knife to save the teacher from a painful execution. But there is, of course, the central phrase, which now everyone is already talking about and knows. Matthew Levi follows me with a goat parchment and writes down after me. I once looked at this parchment and was horrified. I have never said anything like this. I asked him to burn this parchment, and he tore it out of my hands and ran away. And you remember that after what happened, Pontius Pilate asks him to show this parchment. He says, "You want to take the last from me?" I did not say, "Give it," I said, "Let me see it." He wanted to know what Levi had been writing down. And he had written down all sorts of nonsense. At least that's what Bulgakov showed. But the details of the execution are described in such a way, firstly, that Matthew Levi cannot have seen the execution. First, he chose such a place. Read it carefully, not on the gentle side of the hill, but on the back, behind the rocks. With his eyes, he was oriented by the shine of the silver plaque in the form of the head of the lion of Mark Ratslayer, and the lions are Levites. And he hid behind a fig tree, a sick one. That is, Bulgakov also here shows he didn't see a fig. But it's another matter how many variants Bulgakov managed to submit. And everyone reads the variant that corresponds to his own raviousness and corresponds to his worldview. Because every text is the tip of the iceberg, and there is also a subtext. And subtext is revealed, and a novel, any artistic work, a poem, etc., lives for a long time only on account of the subtext, and not on account of the text. An ordinary one-day detective novel has a text, but you can always understand the long life of a work of art only by the presence of a subtext, because now we are not just readers, but we create images. However, now we are mainly watching, not reading, and this is what they steal from us. But those who can retain the ability to create images, those have the advantage. We create images when reading. This is our work, the work of both the left and right hemispheres. And from those images we create, and what do we create? And we create those images which correspond to our worldview, which correspond to our raviousness. Whoever wants to see the execution will see it, and whoever thinks over the text and tries to read the subtext, he will see that there could not have been an execution under any circumstances. But there are three variants, which is why I say that Bulgakov continued the traditions of Russian writers. Three variants. First, Ascension anticipated the execution. How many of you remember the interrogation scene? It is key. A character appears there, a swallow. Now, if this were before the advent of the internet, I will tell you that it would have been very difficult for us to find in the entire Bible, carefully reading, 6 places, 6 times where a swallow is mentioned. But thanks to the internet, we found everything very quickly. The Bible is on the internet in electronic form. And the swallow allegorically means providence. That is, that which is in accordance with providence, and that which does not correspond to providence. Look, the first decision of Pontius Pilate accepts that this wandering philosopher does no harm to anyone. Well, yes, he can confuse people with such sermons. And since he is, after all, in the understanding of Pontius Pilate, also a great healer, he decides to isolate Yeshua from society. But Yeshua did not come into society to be isolated. He carried a certain mission. And he was about to read that protocol, that formula that had already formed in his head. And at that time, a swallow flies in. She first flies in, and then there are such words, the swallow flew free. Pontius Pilate wanted to conclude providence in his residence in Capri, because Yeshua, Christ, carried a certain mission. And from the second moment, when the swallow flew out, there is one very subtle moment. Pay attention to it. Bulgakov does not say right there that Yeshua is in the shadows, but a page before that, you will read that the sun rose higher and higher over the hippodrome and approached Yeshua's feet. Thus, Bulgakov showed that Yeshua was standing in the shadows. If you look at the painting by Nikolai Nikolaevich Gere, What is Truth?, then you will find that Jesus is standing in the shadows. And when the swallow flew free, and this is a symbol of the fact that providence cannot be imprisoned or put in a good security zone, next to Yeshua, a column of dust burst into flames. Try sometime to see how a column of dust can ignite in the shade. We believe that it was precisely from this moment that Yeshua Jesus was no longer, that this is a miracle. Well, now imagine, if he stood before our eyes and suddenly evaporated, how would the crowd take it? Magician and sorcerer, that's it. There is a second variant. We considered everything. After all, you must understand that Pontius Pilate was absolutely autocratic in Judea. He had a very well-organized denunciation service. And from that moment, when at a meeting with Caiaphas, he realized that nothing could be changed, and he perfectly understood the plan of the Sanhedrin. Where does it lead? For Pontius Pilate, there was no problem in replacing the innocent wandering philosopher with another criminal. But now read from this moment. I'm telling you for a reason. I hope you will reread. As soon as he said, on pain of death, I forbid anyone to talk to this criminal. After he had already formulated a sentence, from this moment, no one else, except Pontius Pilate himself, could know who was in prison. And remember the man in the hood, to whom he whispered something. What could he have whispered to him? It was Ephraimius, who was endlessly devoted to him. Take anyone, and replace this one. That is, such a variant is possible. If you read further, you will find endlessly in the novel the phrase, with unseeing eyes. He walked to the platform. He knew that he was standing there, but he never looked at Yeshua. And further in the execution, you will see something even more of interest. Before that, there were robbers and a wandering philosopher. Never about Yeshua does Bulgakov say that he is a robber. But when there were 3 on the cross, there were 3 robbers. Bulgakov could not have been calling Yeshua a robber. But further, there is even more of interest. If you read carefully, you will see that there is a phrase, "The face was so disfigured that it was impossible to recognize it." And who of those who could have recognized Yeshua could have approached? 2 cordons of the cordon, the crowd between the cordons is very far away. And the last thing, when the execution ended, Matthew Levi ran up and cut the ropes. But it does not say in relation to whom he considered Yeshua, but he thought Jesus was on this cross. Now read this passage carefully too. The body fell on him, he looked, and for some reason ran to cut the ropes of the others. Why would he? The dead man does not care whether he is on the cross or on the ground. All 3 were dead. He didn't recognize Yeshua. But we believe that this variant has no right to exist. If he was changed, if he had been sent somewhere, this means that Christ was complicit in a conspiracy. Well, and then you know, Carolingians, Capetian, Merovingian, and all other dynasties from Christ, this is the basis of the sacred mystery and everything that follows. And, after all, we believe that the main idea of the novel is that there was no execution. Well, how did the series show it? Was it able to show? The series is a literal translation. This is just a literal translation where all the dialogues are given, but Kov was not able to show the main idea. Pontius Pilate, Lavrov could not do this. Basilashvili, Volant could not do this. Everyone in the collective played himself. For example, I see a fire tamer in Lavrov, but in Basilashvili, I still see the main roles he played. As for Bezurukov, Yeshua, he plays with fire, because it's not for nothing that they said acting. An actor is an actor. Once he hanged himself on the battery in the image of Yesenin, the second time on the cross, the third time he prepares to die as Pushkin in a duel. It can end very badly for such an actor. Well, as Basilashvili says, talented or not, I, for example, believe that the idea of the novel could not be conveyed to the viewer. Then the adaptation failed, which is why there are so many different opinions. Not all people so attentively studied the novel, but each reading his own vision, his own feeling. And to express a certain idea is to unite everyone, each of whom has something of his own. On the main idea, they will unite. They will disperse on the nuances. Therefore, we believe that Bartko could not film, that is, convey the main idea. But we nevertheless see, as we wrote in a note, very great benefit from the film adaptation. That is, now, in the note about this it said, the society of Russia, in 1,000 years, has overcome idealistic atheism, and in 3 generations has overcome materialistic atheism. And, in order to move towards the kingdom of God on earth, it is still necessary to overcome it at the level of consciousness. To this, without wanting to, Portko by this film also contributed. Circulation increased 30 times. Those who read somehow so frivolously began to reread and read carefully, and perhaps even without taking into account our notes, they will come to the same conclusions that we came to. And therefore we continued this theme about the fact that there was no execution in the analytics of January, which is already on the site. Who has access to the internet, take a look. The meaning is this. Of course, there will be criticism, and it's already started to come, but to be honest, we don't care much. We take the Bible as a document. We abstract from it the fact that Isaiah is a historically real person, or someone on behalf of Isaiah who issued the doctrine of Isaiah's Deuteronomy. The document itself is important for us, because if you look at the antediluvian civilization and understand that God gave freedom of will and freedom of choice to man, then such a dead-end, crowd-elite pyramid was built in the antediluvian civilization that there could be no development, and it was destroyed. The question is, were there any revelations in antediluvian civilization? After all, if God gave one species of all species on earth freedom of will and freedom of choice, then revelation can only play the role of a reminder. And it's said in such a way about the Quran. Now let's look at the post-diluvian civilization. How many years there are, 10,000, 12,000, it doesn't matter. And to what result did they come? Also a dead end, but not in development. There is a dead end in many directions. The biospheric dead end is the destruction of the biosphere, the dead end of nraviousness in many things. There is a dead end in how we reproduce, just like animals, but there is still a difference from the antediluvian civilization. Development has not stopped after all. Those who 5,000 or 4,000 years ago in Egypt were hierophants, the first who first understood that the concentration of productive forces in society is an objective process that develops regardless of the will of any subject, pharaoh, king, jrets. He made an incredible leap. Because objective processes can be governed. But this requires a subjective conception of governance. And we believe that the Bible, which, as a conception, dominates in modern society. There are also others. There is the Quranic, there is Buddhist, there is Shinto, Confucianism. But the biblical dominates through the objects that are used in Japan, India, and China, and this is part of the culture. Because the chain is as follows: the nraviousness of the subject of governance, his worldview in images, his world understanding in lexicon, his vector of objectives which he formulates first for himself, at least in relation to the governance towards the objective process, which is the concentration of the productive forces of society, and then only the conception of governance towards the objective process. And the conception of governance can be calculated only by culture, because culture is secondary in relation to the conception of governance. Culture is everything. It is not only theater, ballet, painting, literature. It is also technology. This is all factological knowledge. This is all extragenetically conditioned information, since there is also genetically determined information. And then it's simple.
Бог создал Адама и Еву. У них родился Каин и Авель. Авель занимался животноводством, Каин земледелием.
Each new generation enters this culture. The culture molds it in the sense that it molds its stereotypes of relations towards the phenomena of the internal and external world. And please, you can govern structurelessly the whole society. For my students, I set one task, at least to solve one problem, to show them that they are a product of this culture. It is necessary to study it and understand what in your activity is from you personally and what is from a product of culture. And we looked for many different ways and found some, as it seemed to us, very effective, at least in the expressions on the faces of these students. We distribute leaflets with a checklist, what we call a vector of objectives. That is, what kind of life partner do you want to have? And the order, that is, priority, is not established there. So they established it. We are doing this in several higher educational institutions, and since the survey is anonymous, we build a bar chart. People are completely different. Well, the age is about the same, from 18 to 20 years old, and we show them almost identical survey results with a small difference. These are all the words that I said. I saw on their faces. Well, uncle, keep talking, some kind of nonsense you are talking. But when I showed it on the screen, on the projector, you see, the imagery had a tremendous impact. Now my students are taking exams, and here I have one student answering my question about what had an effect on her. She said that yes, this had the greatest effect. That is, in this chain, culture forms stereotypes of behavior and then throws in only certain information. So if you take the Bible from the very beginning, then we get the following. God created Adam and Eve, and from them were born Cain and Abel. Cain was engaged in animal husbandry, Abel in agriculture. And they brought, as it says there, a sacrifice to God. God despised the gifts of Cain, but he did not despise the gifts of Abel. But even before that, it is said that when God created people, he said that you should only eat plant foods. So what happens? Abel fulfilled God's instructions on what to eat, but Cain did not. There may be nuances, whether they lived with the same family or not. But what does it mean? God despised the gifts of Cain. We certainly understand that God is not a policeman, but still, imagine the following picture. To whom does the traffic cop pay attention? To the one who breaks the rules, the one he despises, or to the one who does not break them? Despised, in the sense of paying attention. But God does not decide what to do with Cain. And Cain only drew attention, roughly, like a traffic cop. Why are you sneaking, driving at a speed of 30 kilometers? And he directly says to him, if there is no sin on you, then why don't you look me in the eye? Everything is said, but Cain kills Abel. The beginning of sacrifice, where is it from? Let us remember that God gave man freedom of will and freedom of choice. We are talking about the first people. But did the same Cain, Abel, Adam, Eve have any ideas? They had. How can a person distinguish the voice of God from the voice of an egregor? Let's move on to the next step. Abraham hears the voice of God. Go to such and such a mountain, build an altar, and sacrifice your son for a burnt offering. He goes, he prepares, lights the fire. Isaac asks, where are the sacrificial sheep? And God knows when there will be a sacrificial animal. But in the end, when God seems to be convinced that he believes, he stops Abraham's hand. Who is stopping Abraham? Who was Abraham before he knew that there was one God? An idolater. In idolatry, bloody sacrifices are the norm. As a matter of fact, the potential of human development is being realized. Abraham overcomes idolatry. They say the Abrahamic culture, that is, the culture of non-murder, the culture of forgiveness. Well, there the lamb got confused, he still sacrificed an innocent animal. Although, and we often quote the Bible often says that God does not need our sacrifices. They say, why would God need them if everything belongs to Him anyway? He does not eat the flesh of your oxen, and He does not drink the blood of your animals. Look at this, 2 stages in the Bible, from which it's clear that sacrifice is not needed. We did a search on the internet. Now it's not difficult. In the culture of the Aztecs, terrible things happened. Whoever wants can read. There, normally every year, a young man was appointed as a god. He was brought all the honors, in fact, like a god. The king of the Incas, all the Xretzes, he walked among the people, blessed the children. He was fed for a year, decorated with all jewelry. Then he was ritualistically killed. Descriptions are not for the faint of heart. But the most interesting thing, when did they kill him? By date, on the day of Easter, somewhere on April the 26th, 27th. That is, it turns out that sacrifice was normal in the culture of idolatry. And now, after God showed that the sacrifice of neither Cain nor Abel, nor sacrificial animals is needed after what happened to Abraham and his son, God what? Again wanted a bloody sacrifice? That is, we came to this question from afar and showed and connected it with the prophecy of Jonah, who, because he did not want to preach to Nineveh, fell into the belly of a whale, that is, found himself in oppression. And there is a very clear moment where he says, I made a sacrifice to God, not by killing anyone, however, but simply by prayer. And God saved him. We say that now the entire civilization is in oppression, like in the belly of a whale. Why? By 2050, there will be 9 billion people at least. Big cities are less and less adapted to normal human life. Soon there will not be enough clean water. And when such cataclysms occur, weren't there frosts in Russia when there was no central heating, but people survived? Now turn off the electricity, turn off the gas, and a person in a 6 million city is helpless. Everyone can die out, simply freeze. Well, I advise you to read it. There are 30 pages. There are, however, a lot of quotations from the Bible, but I ask you to consider 2 notes as one whole. But the Bible, as a conception, is only a shell. There is something else under it. Again, how can we determine that there is something under the Bible? Only if we begin to carefully study the culture of at least the last 50 years, 2 generations after the change in the logics of social behavior. Here is how we approach this question. That is, at the beginning we had to decide on the conception of governance towards the objective process of concentration of the productive forces of mankind. We calculated, it is the Bible, and then we began to formulate an alternative, seeing what was wrong there. And now a question for all of you. What do you think? The owner of a conception, should he have some kind of a fallback or alternative? He had it. It was not so much an alternative, however, but a continuation. And again, if you look at the culture, it is now quite open. Society, as I say, is a box-watching one. You can see it if you want. Look at the box. I recently watched about 14 programs. What are they about? Who can say? Shows dedicated to esotericism. The shell is falling off. They already also understand that the biblical conception is soon coming to an end. Of course, not without our help. But now they will create an informational kaleidoscope, such that everyday consciousness, which, of course, does not possess the methodology of cognition, distinction, will not be able to distinguish where the truth is, where the lie is. These esoteric shows, you watch these endless American action films where either aliens or something else is acting. 10 programs out of 14 are dedicated either to the curse of the kings about the Templars, or there is a series from the times of the Napoleonic Wars where the Templars also operate. What is the movie Night Watch? What is Day Watch? It's all from the same area. So, esotericism enters into culture. And if any of you have read the famous article by Gilbo in Novi Peterburg, the last biggest jackpot in history, where he says that a netocracy must come to power, and gives the features of this netocracy an almost conceptual power. He took it all off 2 Swedes, Buck, as far as I know, and Zonquist. Born in 1961, they live in Stockholm. They wrote the book Netocracy, somewhere in the range of 300 pages, where they directly say that a totalitarian state can exist equally calmly when information channels, as we had in the USSR, are blocked, but in the same way, a totalitarian state exists when information channels are overflowing with information, simply filled to the utmost. It is impossible to distinguish one from the other. Why? Because ordinary consciousness does not possess distinction. It cannot. There is so much information. This must be looked at, this must be watched, and this must be read. And all the esotericism. Already on the forum, there is a discussion that they say, we have calculated the biblical conception incorrectly, they say. Everything is in the Talmud, in these 200 volumes. They need to be read, but not all of them are available. And there is also the sacred book of Thoth, and also great initiates. And each Masonic lodge has its own ritual. They also need to be studied. Now you have calculated incorrectly. I answer to these guys, you know what? In the year of 1985-1986, when we started out from under the counter, some university Jews brought us home and showed us books. They said, only here you can read. And we realized that if we read and study all this, it will take 20 years. And we will study all this and will not start writing the first lines. But we took up and wrote the way we saw it, and the way we understood it. And now, the conception of social safety exists. And you know that there is a global predictor. Maybe some know of the internal predictor. And we don't prohibit. Please. Those who want to study, study. But esoteric secret knowledge will never be mastered anyway. And secret knowledge, as a rule, is imperfect. And why? Perfect knowledge should not be kept secret. With it, one cannot be harmed. But imperfect knowledge can be used in order to play one group of people against another. I don't want to expand further. It can be spoken about. We watch this discussion. We don't participate in the forums, although once our opinion was expressed, and that's it.